He went to town for fencing wire. He came back with a war. All it took was one woman at a general store counter asking him a question he couldn't answer without looking away, and one padlock on a root cellar that no padlock should ever be on in summer. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd already failed to help someone once. And he had decided, quietly and completely, that he would never let that happen again. This channel lives in the heart of the American West, where cowboys carry grief like saddlebags, where goodness shows up unannounced, and where the simplest act of opening a door can change the course of a life. What this story proves: sometimes courage isn't a rifle and a horse. Sometimes it's just a man who rides 2 miles off the main road because he can't unsee a thing once he's seen it. Subscribe if this kind of story speaks to you. Comment, share it, and come back, because more are coming.
Nettie knew the sound of his walk, the limp he brought back from the war, and the pause he took to pretend he was still a father. The door creaked open and the sunlight felt like a fist. Harlan Calloway stood there, blocking out the world. "Did you eat?" he grumbled, smelling of whiskey and sweat. She just nodded toward the hardtack and water he'd left. He set down a tin plate with more of the same and a piece of jerky that looked tough as boot leather. "Maeve Dunlap stopped by," he said, and Nettie's head shot up. He noticed. "She was just poking her nose where it don't belong. I told her you were sick." He knelt down, his knees popping loud in the quiet. "She believed me. They always do." Harlan's hand snapped out and grabbed her chin, a cold reminder of who held the key. "And she will keep on believing it for as long as I say so. You understand?" Looking away only made it worse, so she met his gaze. "I understand," she whispered. He let her go. "Good. Now, you just need to sign this one last paper." Her voice was small but solid. "No. You got Mama's land when I signed the deed. That's all you're getting." A chill filled the small space. "What did you say to me?" She held her ground. "I said no." He pulled the door shut, plunging them into darkness. "That deed," he said, slow and mean, "was for the 40 acres of dirt. This here paper's for the water rights. Without the water, that land ain't worth a damn. But with it, it's the richest piece of ground in the whole county." He left, and the padlock clicked home. Nettie waited, then scratched another mark on the post. 47 days. Josiah Crane was riding into Abilene for fencing wire. Since his wife passed, the quiet of the early morning was the only peace he found. At Dunlap's general store, Maeve was sorting nails. "Morning, Josiah," she said without looking up. "You happen to ride past the Calloway place?" He shook his head. "Came the North Road. Why?" Maeve stopped her work. "Something ain't right out there, Josiah. Harlan keeps saying his girl Nettie is sick. Been sick for 7 weeks now. That girl's mother, Ruth, left her that land and the water rights. Harlan's been drowning in debt since she died. You do the math." Josiah sighed, not wanting any part of it. "Maeve, what do you want me to do?" "You knew Ruth," she said, and that stopped him cold. Ruth Calloway had been a kind woman. "Just ride by. It is 2 miles off the main road. If it is nothing, you have lost 20 minutes. But if it is something, well, you are not the kind of man who can look away." Josiah loaded his wire and headed south. The Calloway place looked abandoned. Fences were down, weeds choked the garden, and a deep silence hung in the air. He was about to leave when he heard it, a faint sound coming from the ground behind the house. He walked over and saw the root cellar with a heavy padlock on the door. A padlock in the middle of summer. That was not right. He knelt by the wooden door. "Hello?" he called out. A rustle, then a weak voice. "Who's there?" "Name's Josiah Crane. I am a neighbor. Maeve Dunlap asked me to check on you." A sound like a broken sob came through the wood. "Maeve sent you," she whispered. "My father is in town. He will not be back till sundown." Her voice got stronger with every word. "There is a key. It hangs on a nail above the stove in the kitchen. Josiah did not hesitate. He went to the house, found the key right where she said, and walked back. The lock groaned open. He lifted the heavy door and the light hit her face. She was pale and thin, with old scars on her wrists, but her eyes were clear. "How long has he had you down here?" he asked. Her voice was steady. 47 days. Her dress was faded and torn, the same one she must have been wearing when her own father threw her in that cellar, but her eyes were sharp and clear. Josiah knew he would never forget that. She looked like she was broken in 100 places, but not behind the eyes. He asked her, "Can you stand up?" She rose on her own, steadying herself against the damp wall for just a moment. Her father wanted her weak, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. When Josiah offered a hand, she took it, her grip surprisingly firm. As the sun hit her face, she squinted and said, "There's something you need to know. My father made me sign over my mother's land. He told me I would never see daylight again if I did not." Josiah asked if she had signed. "I signed away the land," she said, looking him square in the eye. "But I did not sign the water rights. That is why he left me down there." She took a breath. "He will tell you I am crazy. He will tell the sheriff, the judge, and anyone who will listen that I am unstable. Some will believe him because it is easier to believe a man than a locked door." Josiah looked at her face, seeing not a plea for help, but a woman mapping out a battlefield. He simply asked, "Can you ride?" She nodded. "I can ride." He helped her onto his horse, Slate, and they headed for the main road. Nettie's voice was steady when she said, "He will come for me." Josiah felt her back go stiff against his chest. "I reckon he will," he said. "He has friends who owe him favors." "I expect that too." After a moment, she asked, "Why are you helping me?" Josiah rode on for a spell before he answered. "Because I failed to help a woman once before. She ended up buried in a field with no name to mark the spot." That was all that needed to be said. An hour later, they reached his ranch. It was a solid, well-kept place, but it looked lonely. He helped her down and gave her water from the well. "You can stay in the house. I will sleep in the barn." He saw the look on her face and added, "There is a lock on the bedroom door. It bolts from the inside. The key is on the dresser. You keep it." Something in her expression softened then, a look of recognition for a kindness she did not have to ask for. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "When your father finds out, this will get harder." Nettie stood by the well, looking out at the horizon. "There is something else," she said, turning to face him. "My mother's water rights. They control the irrigation for 3 ranches downstream. That includes Judge Puit's land." Josiah understood at once. Her father did not just want to pay off debts. He wanted power over the very men who could sit in judgment of him. Nettie's voice was like iron. "That is why he locked me in a cellar for 47 days. I am the only thing between him and that kind of control." Josiah looked at this girl in her tattered dress, with rope burns on her wrists, and realized this was not a rescue. This was the start of a war. And he was looking at the only soldier on the right side of it. He knew they would need help, and a way to prove what she said was true. "My mother kept a journal," Nettie said. "She wrote about him, about his drinking. It is hidden under the floorboards in my old room. He does not know about it." Josiah stared at her. "You have been planning for this." "I prayed this day would never come," she said, finally letting her shoulders slump with exhaustion. "But my mother taught me to hope for the best and prepare for a man at his worst." As the sun went down, Josiah sat on the porch step near her. "First thing tomorrow, I will ride to Abilene and talk to Maeve. Then we will see Sheriff Briggs." Nettie shook her head. "Briggs plays cards with my father." "I know," Josiah said. "But even he cannot ignore a locked cellar and rope marks on a young woman's wrists." Nettie looked down at her hands, rubbing the raw skin without thinking. "He will say I did this to myself." "Did you?" Her eyes flashed with fire. "No." Then we will let the marks tell their own story, he said. He saw her flinch when a coyote called in the distance, a sound like a door opening in the dark. He changed the subject. Are you hungry? He went inside and brought back bread, salted pork, and a jar of preserves his late wife Sarah had made. He had not been able to open it until now. Nettie ate slowly, learning to trust food again. She spoke of her mother, Ruth. She was the strongest woman I ever knew, she said. She knew my father was changing, but she believed people could change back. She was wrong about him, but she was right that land and water are the only things a woman can own that a man cannot charm his way into. Josiah nodded. Your mother was a good woman. After my wife passed, she brought soup to this ranch. Sat right here on this porch with me for an hour and did not say a single word. It was the best conversation I had all year. A small, quick smile touched Nettie's lips. That sounds just like her. They sat in a comfortable quiet for a time. Then Nettie's voice turned hard. My father will be home by now. He will drink first. By morning, he will have a story cooked up, one that makes him the poor, wronged father. He will come here, she continued, and he will bring legal papers, not his fists. He learned long ago that paper can hurt worse than a punch. Josiah leaned forward. Then we had better have our own paper ready. That journal. Nettie looked at him, her gaze direct. Maeve sent you for a reason, did not she? She sent the one man in this county who already lost someone he could not save. She knew you would not let it happen a second time. Josiah felt a tightness in his chest. She was right, and saying it out loud would make it too heavy to bear. Get some rest, he said, his voice gentle. Lock the door. She paused at the doorway. Josiah, she said. 47 days. Every morning I told myself someone would come. Every night I told myself I was a fool for hoping. She looked back at him. I was not a fool. He heard the lock turn. He stood on the porch for a long time, the sound of that click echoing in the quiet night. Josiah kept his watch on the road to Abilene, picturing Harlan Calloway finding that cellar empty and starting to plot. The summer air hung thick and quiet, so still you could hear your own heartbeat. Josiah headed for the barn and laid down on some straw, but sleep was a far-off country. Tomorrow, they would ride into town. Tomorrow, the fight would start. Back in Abilene, in a little house with an empty cellar, Harlan Calloway sat at his kitchen table. For the first time in months, he was sober as a judge, studying a property deed by the flickering candlelight, and planning his next move with cold calculation. Josiah was on his feet, rifle in hand, before he was even fully awake. Footsteps on the porch had done it. Dawn was just breaking. The steps stopped. It's just me, Nettie called out. Brought you some coffee. He lowered the gun, letting out a long breath. Stepping outside, he saw her holding 2 tin cups. Her hair was tied back, and she stood taller than before, like something broken inside her was finally starting to mend. Did you get any rest? He asked. More than I have in weeks, she said. That lock you put on the door was a comfort. The coffee was strong enough to peel a mule. He didn't say a word about it. We need to head into Abilene this morning, Josiah said. We'll talk to Maeve, then the sheriff. Nettie shook her head. Briggs won't lift a finger to help us. Maybe not, Josiah replied, but we have to tell him. If we don't, and something happens, your father gets to tell the story his way. Nettie's hands tightened around her cup. There's something else. My father does not just play cards with Sheriff Briggs, he owns him. Briggs owes him $300 from a bad run of luck last winter. My father never called in the debt. He just holds the paper. She looked Josiah square in the eye. You see what that means? The sheriff has to do whatever my father tells him. Josiah set his cup down. The weight of their problem just got a whole lot heavier. All right. We start with Maeve, then. She'll know who else we can trust. There's Judge Pwitt, Nettie suggested. My father controls his water. Not yet, he does not, she said, a spark in her eye. Not until he gets my signature on those water rights. Right now, they're still in my name. The judge has no idea what my father is planning. If we get to him first, we can give him a good reason to stand with us. Nettie nodded. My mother was a smart woman, Josiah. She filed those water rights separate from the deed for a reason. She knew the kind of man my father was turning into. She built a wall to protect the one thing that truly matters out here, the water. They finished their coffee without another word. Josiah saddled his horse, Slate, and a chestnut mare named Copper. He gave Nettie a hand up and they rode toward Abilene. The ride was quiet, taking a little over an hour. Nettie sat tall in the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, watching for any sign of her father. They reached Dunlap's general store as the town was just stirring to life. Maeve was out front, sweeping the steps. When she saw them, she leaned the broom against the wall, planted her hands on her hips, and waited. Well now, Maeve said as they dismounted. Looks like you found something a bit more important than fencing wire. Maeve's eyes were not on Josiah. They were fixed on Nettie. She saw the raw scars on the girl's wrists and the way she held herself like she was braced for a blow. Maeve's face did not soften. It hardened into granite. Get inside, Maeve said, both of you now. She locked the door behind them and flipped the sign to closed. Her son, Levi, a tall young fellow with his mother's sharp eyes, came down from the stockroom. He stopped dead when he saw Nettie. Levi, put a kettle on, Maeve ordered, and get the medical kit from under the counter. I'm fine, Nettie said. No, you are not. You're standing here looking like you just clawed your way out of a coffin. Maeve's voice left no room for argument. Sit down. Nettie sat. Levi brought the warm water and the kit. He took one look at Nettie's wrists and his jaw clenched, but he kept his peace. Maeve worked without a word at first, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the rope burns. The fury in her eyes, though, was anything but gentle. How long? She finally asked, her voice low. 47 days, Nettie answered. In the root cellar. Padlocked? Yes. Maeve paused her work for a second, took a deep breath, and then finished wrapping the first wrist. I came by that house 3 times. He stood right there in the doorway and fed me a line of bull every single time. And I should have known better. Her voice broke for just a moment. He's a good liar, Nettie said quietly. He lied to this whole town. He did not lie to me, Maeve said, her voice firm again. I just was not pushy enough, and that's worse. Levi spoke up from his spot by the counter, his eyes on Nettie. What do you need from us? Something unspoken passed between them, a look of understanding that Josiah saw plain as day. I need the sheriff to know the truth, Nettie said, her voice growing stronger. I need that deed transfer looked into, and I need my water rights protected. We have to get my mother's journal from the house. It is tucked under the floorboards in my old room. Maeve looked up, asking, A journal? My mother wrote down every awful thing my father did, from the day he started drinking until the week she passed away. Every word, every threat. I hid it 3 years ago because I knew he would burn it. Maeve finished wrapping the bandage. So Ruth was building her case all along. The quiet in the room was heavy. Briggs will not help, Maeve said, her voice flat. Harlan has him on a leash. But he is not the only law around here. Judge Pruitt, Josiah said. The judge is a hard man, but he is fair. If we bring him proof, he will listen. But we have to get that journal before Harlan even knows it exists. I will go, Nettie said firmly. No, Josiah and Maeve said together. He is going to expect you. That is exactly why I have to be the one, she insisted. You do not know which board it is. I do. I have done it in the dark 100 times. Levi's quiet voice cut through the tension. She is right. She is the only one who can find it, but she does not have to go by herself. I will go with her, Josiah declared. No, Maeve held up a hand. If Harlan sees you on his land after this, he will claim you are trespassing and Briggs will back him up. You need to stay out of it. Go see Judge Pruitt. You tell him what is going on. Then who goes? I will, Levi said. Maeve studied her son's face for a long moment, then nodded. Take the creek bed. Harlan watches the road, not the water. Nettie stood up. The clean white bandages on her wrists just made her other bruises look worse. Are you sure about this? She asked Levi. He met her gaze. My own mother has spent 3 years regretting she did not step in. I am not about to make that same mistake. They slipped out the back. He is just a boy, Josiah said to Maeve. He is 25, she replied, hanging her apron on a hook. Old enough to know what is right and young enough to still have the fight in him to do something about it. Now go. Judge Pruitt eats at the hotel at noon sharp. Make sure he hears about those rope burns before Harlan gets to him about gambling debts. If this goes south, Josiah, a girl who has been trapped in a hole for 47 days goes right back in. That is not happening. Not in my town. The 20-minute ride gave Josiah time to plan his words. Judge Pruitt was a man who valued facts, not feelings. He liked proof, not pleas. All Josiah had were rope burns and the story of a 22-year-old girl against her father. He found the judge right where Maeve said, at a corner table with roast beef and the local paper. Samuel Pruitt was 60, with a neatly trimmed white beard and eyes that had seen every kind of lie. Judge, Josiah began. Mr. Crane, I do not believe we have any business. We do now, sir. Then sit, but do not waste my time. Josiah laid it all out plain and simple. The cellar, the padlock, the 47 days, the land deed she was forced to sign. He presented it like evidence in a courtroom. Pruitt listened without a word, cutting his beef into perfect squares. When Josiah finished, the judge put down his fork. So you are telling me Harlan Calloway locked up his own daughter to steal her property? Yes, sir. And that property has the water rights Ruth Calloway filed for? Yes, sir. Water rights that, if I remember correctly, feed a number of downstream ranches. Pruitt paused, including my own. Yes, sir. The judge folded his napkin. That is a conflict of interest, Mr. Crane, I understand, but a young woman is trapped, sir. Has the sheriff been told? Not yet. Sheriff Briggs owes Harlan $300 from a poker game. Pruitt's eyes narrowed. Are you sure about that? The girl told me. She heard plenty through that cellar door. The judge leaned back, thinking for a long while. I cannot rule on this myself, but I can send it up to the circuit judge and issue an order to stop any property transfer in the meantime. And the imprisonment? That is a criminal matter for the sheriff. If Briggs will not do his job, the United States Marshal will. Josiah nodded. There is one more thing. Her mother kept a journal detailing years of abuse. They are getting it right now. From the Calloway house. That is a bold move, the judge said, raising an eyebrow. It was the girl's idea. Pruitt picked up his fork again. Bring me that journal, Mr. Crane. And bring me the girl. I want to hear it all from her. He took a bite of beef. I have known Harlan Calloway for 15 years. I just figured his troubles were his own business. Looks like I was wrong. Josiah stood. Thank you, Judge. Do not thank me, he said. Someone should have made me do my job a long time ago. Josiah rode hard for the Calloway place. Maeve had told him to stay away, but a bad feeling was churning in his gut. A man should not send others to fight his battles. A mile out, he heard yelling and spurred his horse into a run. He saw Harlan on the porch holding a shotgun. In the yard, Levi stood with his hands up. Behind him, Nettie was clutching a book to her chest. They had the journal, but Harlan had them cornered. That is my property, Harlan yelled, pointing at the book. She is stealing from me. It belonged to her mother, Levi said, his voice steady. Put the gun down, Mr. Calloway. You are Maeve Dunlap's boy, Harlan sneered. I should have known. Get off my land, not without Nettie. Harlan snapped the shotgun shut. Nettie stepped out from behind Levi. Father? His eyes fixed on her with a cold, ugly look. You come on home, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous low she knew so well. We will forget all about this. You can sleep in your own bed. You will unlock the cellar? Nettie repeated. You say that like it is some kind of gift, like 47 days in the dark can be erased by one night in a bed. I was keeping you safe. You kept me a prisoner, she shot back. You think the world out here is kind? They will use you up. I am all you have. You chained me. You starved me. You made me sign away Mama's land. That land is mine. Mama left it to me. The air was electric. Harlan stepped off the porch. Just then, Josiah rode slowly into the yard, placing himself and his horse squarely between Harlan and the others. Harlan, Josiah said, his voice calm. You, Harlan spat. You are the one who took her. I opened a locked door and helped a woman walk out, Josiah corrected him. There is a big difference. She is not a woman. She's my child, Harlan snarled, his hand tight on his shotgun. Josiah stood firm. She is 22 years old, Harlan, a grown woman whose father forced her to sign away her own land. Harlan let out a nasty laugh. She signed it willingly. You can ask anyone. Josiah's voice was steady. I reckon I'll just ask Judge Pwitt. We have a meeting with him this afternoon. The judge's name landed like a fist. The color drained from Harlan's face. Pwitt has no business in this, he stammered. He does when the water rights you stole feed his own ranch. He's already drawing up an order to freeze that deed. I know what 47 hash marks carved into a post look like. I know the sight of rope burns on a young woman's wrists. And I know a mother's diary filled with dates and details looks like solid gold to a judge. Harlan's eyes locked on the journal in Nettie's arms. Where did you... Nettie's voice was clear. She wrote down everything, Father, every threat, every broken bottle, She dated every single entry and named witnesses. She hid it where you'd never find it. The fight seemed to leave Harlan all at once. For a second, Josiah saw the man he might have been before the bitterness took root. A man who realized his daughter had been planning her freedom longer than he'd been planning her ruin. Give me that book, Harlan said, but his voice was hollow. Please, Nettie. She shook her head. You stopped being my father the night you first locked that cellar door and left me screaming. Harlan looked from Josiah to Levi, then back to his daughter, seeing the three people who stood between him and his control. This ain't over, he whispered. You're right, Nettie said. But the part where I'm scared of you, that part is... Josiah offered Nettie his hand, and she swung up onto the horse behind him. As they rode away, Harlan just stood there, shrinking in the dust. For the first time in 47 days, Nettie did not look back. They rode toward Abilene in a heavy quiet, the kind of silence that comes right before the storm hits. Maeve was waiting for them, her eyes finding the journal in Nettie's hands. She pressed a fist to her mouth. Ruth's journal, she breathed. Josiah nodded. Every page. Judge Pwitt is expecting us. Maeve turned to her son, Levi. What happened out there? Levi's answer was short. Harlan had a shotgun. He didn't use it. For a long moment, Maeve just looked at her son. Then she pulled him into a fierce, quick hug that said more than words ever could. Let's go see the judge, Levi said, his voice a little rough. The four of them walked to the hotel, Josiah and Nettie in the lead, with Maeve and Levi right behind. In a town like Abilene, a walk like that gets folks talking. It was louder than a cannon shot. A man who drank with Harlan on Saturdays watched them pass, then turned and headed straight for the saloon. Well, Josiah muttered, so much for the element of surprise. Nettie's voice was steady. We never had it. In this town, the question is who gets to the judge first with the better story. They found Judge Pwitt in his room, already working on the court order. He stood as they came in, his gaze settling on Nettie. Miss Calloway, he said, gesturing to a chair, I need you to tell me the honest truth, not the brave version, just the truth. Can you do that? Sir, she replied. Being honest is why I just spent 47 days in a cellar. The judge studied her, then picked up his pen. Start from the beginning, he said softly. Nettie told him everything. She didn't cry or raise her voice. She spoke of the night he first locked her in the cellar and tied her wrists to an iron ring. She talked about the meals that became fewer and farther between. She told him about the deed he shoved in her face on day 12 and the water rights papers he brought on day 30. She described carving 47 marks into a post with her own fingernail, one for each day he kept her in the dark. When she finished, the judge asked to see her mother's journal. He read the first page in silence, then closed the book. "These entries are all dated," he said, "and she names folks still living here in Abilene. I'll need to speak with them." He set the journal down. "Miss Calloway, I am issuing a temporary restraining order against your father. He is not to come near you. The deed transfer is frozen. As for the criminal charges, I'll notify Sheriff Briggs. If he doesn't act within 48 hours, I will contact the U.S. Marshals myself." The judge paused. "You should know your father will fight this. It will not be quick and it will not be easy." Nettie looked him square in the eye. "Pain is 47 days in a cellar, Judge. This is just paperwork." A small smile touched the judge's lips. "You sound just like your mother." "That's the finest compliment I've ever been given," she said. They left the hotel and were halfway to the store when Sheriff Briggs stepped out from an alley blocking their path. "Miss Calloway," he said, his arms crossed over his chest, "your father filed a complaint. Says you were taken from his home against your will." Nettie's chin came up. "It was against his will, Sheriff, not mine." The sheriff shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "He says you're not well, that you've been having episodes." "He says a lot of things," Nettie shot back, holding up her bandaged wrists. "Did he mention the rope burns? Did he mention 47 days, Sheriff?" Briggs glanced at her wrists, and for a second, something like shame flickered in his eyes. "I just need to hear both sides of the story." Nettie's voice was firm. "Then you can hear my side right now." "Right here is the place, Sheriff. Judge Pruitt has already heard the story. He is stopping the property transfer and issuing a restraining order right now. You can either take my statement or you can tell the circuit judge and Selena why you chose not to." Sheriff Briggs's face turned a few different shades of red. He glared at Josiah and said, "You did this." "I just opened a door for the truth," Josiah replied. "You are meddling in a family matter. Locking a young woman in a cellar is not a family matter, Sheriff. It is a serious crime." Briggs looked up and down the street. The whole town was watching. Folks were peeking from doorways and windows. Finally, he gave in. "Come to my office," he said. "I will take the statement." "And make the arrest?" Maeve asked. Briggs just turned and walked toward the jail. Inside his office, Nettie gave her statement with every detail sharp and clear. When she finished, Briggs sighed. "I will ride out to the Calloway place tonight." "To arrest him?" Nettie asked. "To talk to him," Briggs said. "You are going to talk to him? After he locked his own daughter in a cellar for 7 weeks? I need to hear his side of the story. You already know his side. You play cards with the man every Saturday night." The room fell silent. Briggs's face got hard as stone. "That has nothing to do with this." $300 says it does." The sheriff shot up from his chair so fast it slammed against the wall. "You watch your mouth, girl." Josiah took one step forward, just enough to be noticed. "She is a victim giving a sworn statement in your office, Sheriff. You might want to remember that." Briggs stared Josiah down for a long moment, then slowly sat. "I will ride out tonight," he repeated. They all left the office as the sun was setting, casting long shadows. As Nettie stepped outside, she stopped cold. Across the street stood Harlan Calloway. He was not drunk or angry. He was clean-shaven, wearing a nice coat, and standing next to a man in a suit. "That is Emmett Slade," Maeve whispered. "A lawyer from Selena. Harlan has already hired an attorney." Harlan looked right at Nettie, gave a tiny tip of his hat, and walked into the saloon with Slade. They were left standing there with a filed statement, a recovered journal, and the sudden chilling realization that Harlan Calloway was playing a much bigger game. "He is not fighting like a drunk anymore," she said, her voice low. "No," Josiah agreed. "He surely is not. Emmett Slade worked quicker than a prairie fire. By the next morning, a whole new story was all over Abilene. Harlan Calloway was now a poor, misunderstood father, a war veteran pushed too far by a daughter who had become unstable after her mother died. Josiah heard this new tale from Pete Holm, a young man who brought a grain delivery out to the ranch. Mr. Slade was in the saloon last night, buying drinks and telling everyone how Harlan has been trying to get his daughter help. He says she hurts her own wrists and locks herself in small places on account of her sadness. And folks believe that? Pete stared at his boots. Some do. It is an easier story to swallow. Josiah paid the young man and went to the barn. Nettie was brushing a horse named Copper, keeping her hands busy to quiet her mind. Slade is already spreading his poison, Josiah said. I know, Nettie answered without stopping. He is telling them I am crazy. He is telling them a story that makes my father look like a hero. That is the same story my father has been telling for years. Slade just put it in a fancy suit. She leaned against the horse. What did Pete's face look like? He looked uncomfortable. That means he half believes it. Now imagine every man in town who would rather believe a father over a daughter, and you have got Slade's jury. Josiah rested on the stall door. Judge Pewitt's order is official. The property transfer is frozen. That will not stop Slade, Nettie said. He will just say the judge has a conflict of interest and get the whole case moved to a judge in Salina who does not know any of us. You think he is that slick? My father hired him for a reason. Harlan Calloway might be a drunk, but he has never been a fool. That is what makes him so dangerous. So what do? We have to get to the people in that journal before Slade does, Nettie declared. Dr. Hensley, who treated my mother's bruises, Reverend Pike, who saw the aftermath of my father's rages, and Mrs. Aldrich, our neighbor, who heard me screaming. If Slade gets to them first, that journal is just a dead woman's words. Then let us go now. Not us, she corrected. Me and Maeve. A man cannot talk to Dr. Hensley about this. He needs to hear it from a woman, so he feels like he can still do the right thing. Josiah knew she was right. What about me? You go to Judge Pwitt, tell him Slade is already dirtying the waters, and ask him to move up the hearing. The longer we wait, the more time that lawyer has to hide the truth. They rode into Abilene together, then separated. Nettie headed for Maeve's store, while Josiah went to the judge's hotel room. He found the door locked with a note pinned to it. It read, Court business in Salina. Return Thursday. Thursday was 4 days away. Josiah felt the ground fall out from under him. The judge was gone. Slade was hard at work, and Harlan Calloway had 4 free days to do his worst. He rushed over to Maeve's store. Nettie and Maeve were looking over the journal. Pwitt is gone to Salina, Josiah announced. That is no coincidence, Nettie said, looking at Maeve. Slade pulled him out of town on purpose. All he had to do was file some paperwork that required the judge to be there. Even a pointless motion buys him 4 days. Nettie's hands lay flat on the counter. 4 days. That is all he needs. For what? Josiah asked. To build a case that I am not competent. If Slade can get a doctor to declare me mentally unfit before the hearing, then the property transfer is legal. My signature is valid, and my testimony becomes nothing more than the ramblings of a troubled girl. The air in the room turned cold. He cannot get a doctor to say that, Maeve argued. Hensley knows you. Slade does not need Hensley. He just needs any doctor from Salina or Topeka who will sign a piece of paper for the right price. That is just plain corruption, Levi said. That is Kansas, Nettie replied. Maeve stood up straight. Then we do not wait for Thursday. We go to the witnesses right now and get their statements in writing before Slade can ever reach them. Nettie nodded. Dr. Hensley is first, then Reverend Pike, and then Mrs. Aldrich. I will go with you to Hensley's, Maeve said. Josiah, you and Levi go find Mrs. Aldrich. She is old and afraid, but she knows what she heard. They split up and raced against time. Maeve and Nettie walked to Dr. Hensley's office, which was upstairs from the apothecary. Nettie took a deep breath and knocked on his door. His face shifted from surprise to recognition, and then to a look that was mighty close to dread. "Nettie Calloway. Dr. Hensley, can we come in?" He hesitated for just a moment before stepping aside. "I heard you were staying with Josiah Crane," the doctor said, avoiding her eyes. "Your father stopped by. Told me you'd had another one of your spells." "My father," Nettie said, her voice like ice, "locked me in a root cellar for 47 days. The doctor went perfectly still. "I am telling you what happened," Nettie insisted, holding up her bandaged wrists. "These are from a rope tied to an iron ring." He stared at her bandages. "I treated your mother once," he said quietly. "She told me she fell." "She didn't fall," Nettie said. "And I think you knew it. But you wrote it down as a fall because that's what she told you to do." The doctor's hands were shaking as he cleaned his spectacles. "That's a fair accusation." "It is not an accusation, Doctor. It is a fact. I am here to give you the chance to do for me what you couldn't do for my mother." Maeve stepped forward. "We need a written statement, Thomas, about Ruth's injuries and your professional opinion on whether they came from a fall." The doctor swallowed hard. "If I write that, I'm calling Harlan Calloway a liar. That carries a price in this town." Maeve's voice was like steel. "The price for not writing it is that girl goes right back in the cellar. Ruth is gone, but Thomas Nettie is not. You have to choose who you can still help." That was all Dr. Hensley needed to hear. He sat down and began to write. He noted that he had treated Ruth Calloway 3 separate times, and her injuries were a far cry from just falling down. Meanwhile, Josiah and Levi stood on Mrs. Aldrich's porch. The 72-year-old woman knew who they were before they even spoke. She had been wondering when someone would finally come asking. She led them inside and confessed, "I heard her screaming that first night. For 47 nights I told myself it was just a coyote. I counted every single one, knowing darn well it was not." Her voice was steady, but tears streamed down her face. She was too old and too scared to do anything then, but she was ready to make it right. She promised to write down everything she heard. They had her statement and the doctor's, plus one more from Reverend Pike. He had seen Harlan strike Ruth clear across the face 2 years earlier, but had only prayed about it. When Maeve told Nettie, her jaw was set tight as a drum. "He watched my father hit my mother, and all he did was pray." Maeve reminded her that he was willing to stand up now. Nettie was not impressed. "Every one of them watched my family crumble. They chose comfort over courage." Maeve said softly, "Late courage is still courage, honey." Nettie just looked at her. "Tell that to my mother." They spread the 3 statements out on the counter. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "We have to get to Selina before Slade files that motion," Nettie insisted. "How do we know he ain't already done it?" Levi asked. "He can't," she replied. "Needs a doctor's signature, and even a crooked one takes a couple of days." "So we've got 2 days," Josiah figured. "Less," Nettie shot back. "My father is smart enough to have sent Slade ahead with his own story. They'll find a doctor who will declare me unfit without ever laying eyes on me." Levi's voice went hard. "They can do that?" Maeve slammed her palm on the counter. "It's a loophole big enough to drive a wagon through, so we'll drive our own wagon right over them." Nettie nodded. "We take this journal to the circuit court ourselves. We file it first, and we demand they use a doctor of my choosing." "Can we do that?" Josiah asked, his brow furrowed. "I don't rightly know," Nettie admitted. "But I know it's better than sitting here waiting for some man in a suit to decide my mind is broken." "Then we ride for Selina," Josiah declared. "Tomorrow morning." "Tonight," Nettie corrected, her eyes burning with resolve. "If Slade has a head start, we can't afford to waste 12 hours sleeping." Josiah saw she was running on pure will. "And something tougher than that. The same thing that got her through 47 days of counting marks on a cellar wall." "Tonight," he agreed. For 2 hours they moved with purpose. Maeve packed supplies, Levi saw to the horses, and Josiah secured the wagon. All the while, Nettie sat at the table and wrote. She filled a page with a list of names, dates, and amounts owed. "How in the world do you know all this?" Josiah asked her. "My father talks to himself when he's drinking," she said without looking up. "He'd sit right above the cellar and list every debt aloud like he was balancing a ledger in his head. I couldn't write it down then, so I memorized every last word." She finally set the pen down. "He thought locking me in that cellar made me helpless. He never imagined it would make me dangerous." Maeve walked in with a bag and saw the list. "What's that?" "Insurance," Nettie said. They left Abilene at dusk with 40 miles of hard prairie ahead. Josiah drove the wagon with Nettie beside him, while Maeve and Levi followed on horseback. 3 hours into the long night ride, Levi pulled his horse up next to the wagon. "Rider behind us," he said quietly. "About a half-mile back." Josiah kept his eyes forward. "How many?" "Just one. He's matching our pace, move for move." Nettie's hands tightened on the wagon seat. "That wouldn't be my father. He wouldn't come alone." "Horse is too small, and the rider sits too straight," Levi added. "Slade," Josiah said, "or someone he sent." Josiah pulled the wagon to a stop. In the distance, the rider stopped too. Under the thick blanket of stars, the prairie was wide open. "We keep moving," Nettie said. "Let him follow. Slade will figure out we're heading to Selena anyway. I'd rather fight a man who sees me coming than sneak around like I've got something to hide." Josiah looked at her in the starlight. "You've given this a lot of thought." 47 days is a long time to think," she replied. They pushed on, with the shadow following behind. Levi rode back to get a better look. "It's Carl Ducker from the livery," he reported. "He's on Slade's payroll now." "Ducker is harmless," Maeve said. "A harmless man stops being harmless when the price is right," Nettie answered. Near midnight, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. "You should try to sleep," Josiah told her as she washed her hands in the cool water. "I can't. You'll all need me to be sharp in Selena." She stood and dried her hands. "Josiah?" "Yeah." "Why did your wife pick that chestnut mare?" The question caught him by surprise. "Sarah always said the horse had kind eyes. She was right. Copper was the first animal that didn't shy away from my touch." Nettie paused. "Your wife sounds like she was good at seeing things." "She was good at everything," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you lost her." "I'm sorry you lost your mother," she replied. They stood there in the dark, two people who understood what it meant to lose the one person who made the world make sense. Levi appeared out of the darkness. "Ducker's not following anymore. He's made camp about a quarter-mile back." "He doesn't need to," Nettie said. "He already knows where we're going." They loaded back up and pushed on through the long night. Maeve dozed in her saddle while Levi kept watch. Josiah drove and Nettie sat beside him, her mother's journal in her lap, riding toward a courthouse in a town where no one knew her name. Dawn found them just 10 miles from Selena. Nettie had finally drifted off, leaning against the wagon with the journal clutched tight. She woke with a start when a wheel hit a rut. "How far?" she asked, instantly alert. "We're close," Josiah said. "We'll be there before the courthouse opens." She smoothed her dress, the same one she had worn in the cellar. Maeve had offered her another, but Nettie refused. "I want the judge to see what 47 days looks like," she'd said. They rolled into Selena as the town was coming to life. The four of them stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sun rise. "Whatever happens in there," Nettie said, "I need y'all to know I chose this. I'm here because my mother left me something worth fighting for and my father tried to steal it. I would rather lose in that courtroom than win by staying quiet." "You're not going to lose," Levi said. Nettie looked at him. "You can't promise that." "No," he said, "but I can promise I'll be standing right there with you." The courthouse doors opened. A clerk stepped out and raised an eyebrow at the four dusty travelers. "We need to file an emergency petition with the circuit court," Nettie stated clearly. Nettie Calloway had to see a judge before some lawyer named Emmett Slade beat her to it. The clerk took one look at her bandaged wrists, the journal she clutched in her hands, and the three friends standing behind her like a solid wall. He just nodded and said, "Come on inside." They walked single file into that courthouse. Nettie led the way, her back ramrod straight, the white bandages on her wrists catching the morning sun. Behind her were Maeve, Levi, and Josiah, four folks from Abilene who rode all night long, all because a young woman who'd spent 47 days buried alive refused to let another sunrise pass without a fight. And somewhere on the road, a fella named Carl Ducker was riding hard back to Abilene to tell Harlan Calloway his own daughter just walked into the one place where his locks and chains meant nothing at all. The clerk, Howard Marsh, moved like a man who'd seen his share of trouble. He led them to a quiet room with a long table and told them to wait. Nettie laid out her proof: the journal, 3 sworn statements, and her own handwritten list of her father's debts. "The circuit judge is Arthur Waverly," the clerk said. "He starts at 8 o'clock sharp." Nettie asked, "Has anyone else filed something this morning?" Marsh paused. "A Mr. Slade filed a competency motion late yesterday." Nettie repeated his words. "Yesterday afternoon." She looked straight at Josiah. "He filed it before we even left town. He knew Judge Pwitt was gone. He planned this whole thing." Maeve asked, "Can we still file our case before his?" Marsh told them, "You can file anything you like. Whether the judge hears your side first is entirely up to him." Then he left them alone. The four of them sat there, the room smelling of old books. Nettie opened the journal to the last page, to her mother Ruth Calloway's final words. Levi asked softly, "What's it say?" Nettie's voice was strong as she read it out loud. April 14th, 1874. Harlan came home at 3 in the morning. He busted a kitchen chair and told me if I ever tried to leave, he would make sure Nettie never did either. And I believe him. I'm hiding this journal. If something happens to me, Nettie will know where it is. She is smarter than he'll ever know. No one said a word. "That was 4 years ago," Nettie said, her voice like steel. "She died 6 months later. And my father started in on me that very same year." The door swung open, and in walked Judge Arthur Waverly. He looked to be about 50, with a sharp jaw and eyes that got straight to the point. He held a file in one hand and coffee in the other. "I have a motion from one Emmett Slade about the competency of Harlan Calloway's daughter," the judge said, sitting down without any preamble. "And then I have 4 people who rode all night to stop it. Somebody better tell me why I ought to listen to you first." Nettie stood right up. "Because that motion is a lie, Your Honor. My father filed it to keep me from testifying about how he stole my property. He locked me in a root cellar for 47 days and forced me to sign a deed. I have my mother's journal to prove his years of abuse, 3 sworn statements from witnesses, and the rope burns on my wrists to prove the rest." Judge Waverly looked from her wrists to the papers on the table, and then right into her eyes. "Sit down, Miss Calloway. You start at the beginning, and don't you leave a single thing out." So Nettie sat, and she told him everything. She spoke for 30 minutes with no tears and no dramatics. She just laid out the facts, the same ones she had repeated to herself in the dark for 47 days. The judge read the journal. He read every single statement. He read her list of debts. When he was done, he looked up at Nettie. "This list. How did you get all this information?" She answered, "My father talks to himself when he's drinking. He would sit right above the cellar door nearly every night and go over his money troubles out loud. I memorized it all." "You memorized names and amounts while locked underground?" the judge asked. Nettie met his gaze. "I had 47 days with nothing else to do but listen and remember." Judge Waverly leaned back in his chair. "Miss Calloway, I'll be blunt. Mr. Slade's motion says you suffer from melancholia. It claims you are not fit to manage your own life. It is supported by a signed paper from a Dr. Franklin Poole, who says that based on your father's word, you show signs of mental instability. Nettie's voice was firm. Dr. Poole has never laid eyes on me. I am aware, the judge said, and he is willing to declare me unfit based on the word of the very man who locked me in a cellar. Judge Waverley's jaw clenched. The law does allow for family testimony in these matters. It is a part of the law I have never cared for. Then examine me yourself, Nettie challenged, leaning forward. Right here. Ask me anything you want. Test my memory, my reason. If I am unfit, you will know it. You'll know. And if I am not, then that doctor's paper is nothing but a bought and paid for opinion. The room was dead silent. The judge studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to his clerk. Howard, send for Dr. Harmon. Tell him I need an independent examination done today. He then stood up. I'm going to take a recess until the doctor arrives. Miss Calloway, you and your friends will stay right here in this building. Mr. Slade is due in my court at 2 o'clock. As he left, Nettie finally let out a long breath. You did real good, Maeve said, her voice thick with emotion. Nettie shook her head. I just did what my mother never got the chance to do. A minute later, Levi, who was watching the street, said, Someone's coming, a man in a suit walking fast. That'll be Slade, Nettie said. And sure enough, the door flew open, and in stormed Emmett Slade. Right behind him, to everyone's shock, was Harlan Calloway himself. Nettie shot up from her chair. Josiah was by her side in an instant. Get him out of here, Nettie demanded, her eyes locked on her father. Judge Pruitt issued an order. He cannot be within 100 feet of me. Slade just smiled. That judge's order is for Dickinson County. We are in Saline County now, a different jurisdiction. That's a technicality, Nettie shot back. The law is made of technicalities, Miss Calloway. It is what makes it so useful. Harlan finally spoke, his voice soft. He looked clean and sober in his good coat. Nettie, he said, I just want to talk. You had 47 days to talk, she replied. You spent them on the other side of a locked door. I was trying to protect you, he pleaded. You were trying to steal from me. Slade held up a hand. Miss Calloway, your father has authorized me to make you an offer. He will drop this competency motion. He will give up all claims to the water rights. All you have to do is return the land deed and agree to drop any criminal charges. The room fell silent. He wants me to give back the land, Nettie said, her voice dangerously low, and pretend that cellar never happened. He wants to resolve this as a family, Slade said smoothly. Without consequences, you mean, Nettie replied. She looked past the lawyer straight at her father. Is that what you want, Father? Peace? Harlan's face crumpled. I want my daughter back. You never lost me, she said. You put me in a cage. There is a difference. I made mistakes, he whispered. You chained my hands to an iron ring. I was drinking, he cried. I was not myself. Oh, you were exactly yourself, she said. The drinking just made you stop pretending. His composure finally shattered. Your mother, he choked out. She would have wanted us to work this out. Nettie went completely still. The anger that flashed in her eyes was white hot. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper that filled the entire room. Don't you dare speak her name. She wrote about you every single night. Every single time you came home drunk, every bruise, every threat. She hid a journal under my floorboards because she knew you would destroy it, and she trusted me to find it. Her voice was steady and clear. You did not know her. You owned her. And when she died, you started owning me. Harlan staggered back like he'd been hit. Slade stepped in smoothly. Miss Calloway, emotional outbursts will not serve you well here. That was not an outburst, Mr. Slade, she replied. That was testimony. The door behind them opened. Judge Waverley walked in, followed by an older man with a doctor's bag. The judge's sharp gaze landed on Harlan and Slade. Mr. Slade, I did not send for you. I came to help facilitate a resolution for my client. You came to intimidate a witness in my courthouse, the judge snapped. Mr. Calloway, there is a restraining order against you. You will wait outside this building or I will have you removed. Your Honor, Slade started. Outside, now. Harlan looked at Nettie one last time, then turned and walked out. Slade followed, but paused at the door. The offer stands. No, Nettie said. It does not. Waverly closed the door and introduced Dr. Harmon. Doctor, I need you to conduct a mental competency examination of Miss Calloway. Take your time. Be thorough. The judge brought in a Dr. Harmon to give a professional opinion. When he asked Nettie if she wanted a private examination, she said, "No, sir. I want everyone in this room to hear what you have to say." For the next hour, he asked her about her memory, her reasoning, and the details in her mother's journal. He even had her count backward from 100 by sevens. When he finished, he turned to Judge Waverly. This woman is not incompetent. In fact, she is one of the sharpest minds I have had the pleasure of examining this year. The man who signed that affidavit without ever meeting her should be ashamed of himself. That girl spent 47 days locked underground. She does not need a competency hearing. She needs justice. Judge Waverly folded his hands. Ms. Calloway, he said, based on the evidence, I am issuing a few orders. First, the motion to question your competency is denied. Second, the land deed signed under duress is now void. Third, the water rights your mother filed are yours. And fourth, I am asking the United States Marshals to investigate your imprisonment. Nettie's father would be arrested. The wheels turn slow, the judge said, but they do turn. Nettie closed her eyes for just a second. Thank you, Your Honor. He shook his head. Do not thank me. Thank your mother. She built this case from her grave. You just delivered it. After he left, Maeve walked over and pulled Nettie into a hug. For the first time, she did not pull away. She just let someone hold her. It was the first time in 4 years. Maeve whispered, "Your mama would be so proud." Nettie clutched the journal to her chest. She would be furious it took me this long. By the door, Josiah and Levi stood in quiet support, which was all that was needed from them. "We should go home," Nettie said, looking at Josiah. "To your ranch, if that is still all right." He simply nodded. Outside in the sun, Slade watched them from across the street with his arms crossed, looking like a man figuring his next move. Harlan was nowhere to be seen. "He will appeal," Nettie said as Josiah helped her into the wagon. "Let him," Josiah answered. "You stood up to that lawyer and made a judge listen. Your mother knew you had the strength to use her journal. I believe in that." He climbed up next to her. "Yes, I surely do." The road west from Salina was long and hot. Hours down the trail, Levi called out, "Rider coming toward us!" Josiah's hand went to his rifle, but Nettie stopped him. The man wore a star, but he was not Sheriff Briggs. He tipped his hat. "Miss Calloway, I am Deputy United States Marshal James Beckett. Judge Waverly sent word for me to ride to Abilene and execute a warrant for Harlan Calloway." Nettie's hand tightened on the journal. "He is dangerous when trapped." "Most men are, ma'am," Beckett said. "That is why they sent me." He then looked to Josiah. "The judge mentioned you, said you opened a door for her." "That is all I did," Josiah replied. "Sometimes that is enough." The marshal nodded and rode on toward Abilene, kicking up dust behind him. Nettie watched him go, a small weight lifting off her. "Josiah," she said softly, "thank you for opening the door." He just kept driving the wagon west, toward home. Hours later, Pete Holm rode up hard, his face covered in dust. "The marshal arrested Harlan," he said, breathing hard. "But it did not go smoothly." Nettie sat up straight. "What happened?" "Harlan barricaded himself inside the house," Pete explained. "He came out with a rifle, but then gave up. But he was yelling for the whole town to hear, calling you a liar and saying Josiah Crane stole you for your land." "And did people listen?" Maeve asked. "Some were nodding," Pete admitted. But then Mrs. Aldrich marched out of her house. She went right up to Harlan as the marshal was cuffing him and said, I heard her screaming for 47 nights. You can call me a liar, too. The entire street went dead quiet after that. Nettie closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she had a new resolve. Where is he now? In jail. Beckett is taking him to Topeka for federal charges. Briggs tried to intervene. Beckett told him to step back or share a cell with Harlan. Briggs just walked away. They continued on, the wagon rolling in a heavy silence. As they got close to the ranch, Nettie finally spoke. He will try to contact me from jail. He will send a letter saying he is sorry, that he needs me. You do not have to answer, Josiah told her. I know. But a part of me remembers the father he was, the one who taught me to ride and built my bookshelves. Her voice was tight with emotion. The man who locked me in that cellar is not the same person, but they live in the same body. I do not know how to hate one without hating the other. Josiah offered no easy comfort. He knew some wounds never truly heal. You just learn how to carry them. You do not have to figure that out tonight, he said. They reached the ranch well after dark, moving through the evening chores in silence. After a while, they all sat on the porch drinking coffee in the dark. Nettie stared down the road toward the east. There is something I have to do tomorrow, she said. I need to go back to my mother's house. Maeve began to protest, but Nettie stopped her. I have been running from that place for 47 days. If I do not walk through that door on my own terms, it will own me the same way he did. Nobody argued with her reasoning. I will go alone, Nettie added. No, you will not, the three of them said, almost at once. A small, rough laugh escaped her. Fine. But I go inside first, and nobody follows. The next morning, they rode to the Calloway property. They waited at the fence line while Nettie walked to the front door alone. She stood there for a long moment, then pushed it open and went inside. For what felt like 20 minutes of held breath, they waited. When she came out, her face was wet with tears, but her back was straight. She carried a small wooden box. My mother's things, she said. And this. She held up a document. The original deed to the water rights. She sewed it into the lining of her winter coat. Maeve was amazed. She looked like she was keeping house, but she was building an arsenal. Nettie tucked the box under her arm. I am done here. I want to go home. She looked at Josiah. I mean, to your ranch. I do not really have a home right now. You do, Josiah said gently, for as long as you need one. She mounted her horse and rode away without looking back. 2 days later, Marshal Beckett sat on their porch. He delivered the news plainly. Your father is being transported to Topeka for trial. The deed transfer has been voided. The water rights are in your name. And Sheriff Briggs has resigned, effective immediately. The news came quickly after that. The crooked lawyer, Slade, had skipped town. The doctor who signed the false paper was having his license reviewed by the state. The legal fight was over. Josiah asked her, So what comes next for you, Miss Calloway? She thought for a long while, no longer in a hurry. I want to rebuild my mother's house, she said. I want to fix the fences and plant the garden again. And I want to use the water rights the way she wanted. Not for profit, but for all the ranches downstream that need it. Fair access for everyone, the way it should have been. The following weeks were filled with purpose. Nettie worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences and clearing the land. Levi came out every couple of days to help with the heavy lifting. He did not talk much, but he asked gentle questions about her mother and the garden. One afternoon, Nettie stopped and looked right at him. Why do you keep coming out here? Levi put his hammer down. Because you need help. A lot of folks need help, she said. He met her gaze. No, I do not ride 2 hours for all of them. A quiet understanding passed between them. When he handed her a board, their fingers touched. That day, Levi stayed an hour longer than usual, and Nettie watched him ride away for longer than a woman watches a man she is not thinking about. And Maeve noticed. Of course she did. Maeve came by one evening with a supper basket. While Josiah saw to the horses, she sat with Nettie on the porch. "My boy has taken a real shine to you," Maeve said. "I know," Nettie replied. "But do you like him?" Nettie looked away, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Nothing in my life is simple." Maeve just waited, patient. At last, Nettie spoke, her voice soft. "After 4 years living in the dark, he was the first one who didn't try to be a light. He just stood nearby and let me find my own way out." A genuine smile broke across Maeve's face. "That is the finest thing anyone has ever said about my son." A month later, a letter came. The envelope bore her father's shaky handwriting. She held it for a good long while before finding the nerve to open it. Josiah offered to stay, but she told him she had to do it alone. The letter was short. It said he was sorry. It said the drink had carried him off to a place he never intended to be. He wrote that he remembered the little bookshelf he had built for her. He said the man who built that shelf was still in there somewhere, buried deep and ashamed. Nettie read it through twice. Then she folded it up and put it in the wooden box with her mother's things. She did not cry, and she did not tear it to pieces. When Josiah walked back from the fence line, she simply said, "He says he is sorry." "Do you believe him?" Josiah asked. "I believe he means it right now," she answered. "I just don't know if right now is enough." Fall came on early that year, and Nettie's garden gave up its first harvest. She brought a basket heaped with vegetables to Maeve's store. Maeve looked from the basket to Nettie's face, then pulled the girl into a hug that said more than words ever could. Not long after, Judge Pruitt stopped by the ranch. He told them Harlan had pleaded guilty up in Topeka. The sentence was 5 years, and the water rights to her land were filed in her name, permanent and uncontested. "Your mother would have been proud," the judge said softly. "I know," Nettie said, her voice thick. "I just wish she was here to see it." Levi had started coming to dinner most nights, always bringing firewood or a jar of his mother's preserves. After they ate, Josiah would always find some chore to do with the horses, leaving the two of them alone on the porch. That night, in the cooling air, Levi said, "I have something to ask you." "Then ask." "There is a harvest dance in town next Saturday. Would you—" "Yes," she said, cutting him off with a smile. He grinned right back at her. Sitting there with a good stew on her stove and a garden in the ground, Nettie Calloway felt something she had not felt in 4 long years. It was not safety or justice. It was not even love, though that was coming on slow and steady. She felt free. It was the quiet freedom of choosing to stay put, knowing the door at her back finally opened both ways. Josiah watched them from the barn door. He thought of the 47 marks carved into a cellar post by a girl who refused to be forgotten. He thought of how a simple trip for fencing wire had turned into a war. And he remembered what Maeve had told him that first day. "You are not the kind of man who can unsee a thing once he has seen it." She was right. He could not, and he was glad of it. At the dance, Nettie wore a blue cotton dress Maeve had made her. Levi wore a clean shirt and boots polished to a high shine. They danced, and she stepped on his feet twice, and he did not say a word about it. From a chair by the wall, folks watched them with happy tears in their eyes. Josiah stood at the edge of the room when Maeve came to stand beside him. "You did a good thing, Josiah Crane." "All I did was open a door," he said. "Sometimes," Maeve replied, "that is what a good thing looks like. Just opening a door." The music swelled as people danced. Nettie laughed at something Levi said, and the sound carried across the room like a bell finally ringing after years of silence. Miles away, Harlan Calloway sat in a federal cell and counted the quiet days, just as his daughter had once done, wondering if anyone would ever come. The difference was Nettie had stopped counting. She did not need to anymore. The door was open. The life ahead was hers, not given or stolen, but earned. Every single day of it. earned. Now, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me which part of this journey stayed with you the most. Every story here is retold with care to find its deepest meaning. If this is the kind of storytelling that speaks to you, please stay with us. There are more stories on the way, and maybe the next one will be a reminder that it only takes one open door to start your own life anew. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.